not the most flattering angle. Another of my colleagues. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us here today in this beautiful UNFCCC Climate Change Pavilion. I know everyone had to jump through hoops and go through an obstacle course to get here, so I really appreciate you being with us here or virtually. We have an amazing panel and a topic that I think a lot of people like to think about, which is nature. And, you know, here at we've been hearing a lot about the new deforestation pledge and other conversations about nature-based climate solutions. So we wanted to bring together this panel of experts from different sides of the coin to help us think about connecting nature-based solutions and climate work, obviously, as we are here at COP26. So I'll just set up the sort of theme for this discussion, and then we'll have some questions for the panelists, and then some time for Q&A from the audience. So a theme that we've seen over the years at COP is, you know, attention to discussions about deforestation at first, and then broader discussions about extinction of species, ecosystem resilience, adaptation, and we've seen this portfolio of topics related to nature kind of growing at COP, which I think is a very good thing. And yet we also maybe sometimes see a bit of a siloed discussion about just carbon emissions without necessarily connecting it to nature. So we're hoping to connect those things on this panel today. I think many of us feel intrinsic value for nature, but what we are hoping to explore today is how do we think about nature in terms of financial value? And where is the industry moving, whether you're an insurer, you're a development bank, you're a coalition of businesses and investors, to begin linking nature with climate risk with corporate decision making as well. So earlier this week, we had an announcement from governments that included a commitment to halting deforestation by 2030. You know, similar to the commitment that was made in 2014, but importantly including more countries that have significant forests within their borders. Urgency, we're aware that we're in a climate crisis. There's so much urgency about addressing climate risks and opportunities. Do we have time to be discussing nature? Why do you think that nature is coming up so frequently more and more in these discussions here?
Thank you, Divya. Yes. Well, I often hear people say, oh, we're busy doing climate now. Can't nature wait? Well, I guess the biggest reason I can give you to say, no, you can't, is have you ever heard of COVID-19? What is that? It's a tiny speck of nature that came out of nowhere and has turned our economies upside down. The IMF reckons we are spending roughly $27 trillion so far propping up economies around the world because of this. Now, this is what we mean by nature-related risk that is unrecognized in portfolios, unrecognized by central banks, unrecognized by governments, and wow, it comes and smacks us in the face. This isn't a health problem, it's an environmental problem. It's caused by the degradation of nature, possibly the trade in endangered species. These are spillovers or zoonotic transfers of viruses from animals to humans, which somehow get turbocharged on the way. Now, to say that nature's not important in your portfolio is to be blind. And indeed, that is exactly the situation we have with many of the terminals that are providing the data upon which asset managers and bankers make decisions about what they lend to or invest in. It's like driving a car in the 1950s. You have a speedometer and how much fuel is in the tank, and that's pretty much all we had. So what we've got to do is make it like a car today, where you have beepers on the bumper, you have a navigation system, an incredible array of data on your dashboard, which keeps you safe. And at the moment, what we have on our finance dashboard is not enough to keep the world safe. So when you make a lot of investments like this, either lending or investment into, say, the food sector, or possibly infrastructure, transport, a lot of the time you roll over nature in the process. And the cost of that, and indeed the number of hectares or any kind of data on that, is simply missing from the transaction. So the company looks like a buy. The simple example might be a palm oil company that destroys a rainforest. The cost of destroying the rainforest, the lack of water, the changing human lives, the species that have gone up in smoke, does not appear in the price of palm oil or in the share price of the company. So it's a buy. It's great for my pension fund. It's going to make loads of money over decades. But there's a huge piece missing. And that's what we're coming to terms with at this climate conference. Because in the past, it was all about energy. But today, at this conference, nature has come alongside energy as being one of the great solutions to the climate change problem and keeping our planet safe.
So I apologize, a bit back to front, but one of the topics we're going to get to here is the Task Force for Nature-Related Financial Disclosures. And so if you could just quickly introduce yourself, that would be great.
Yeah, we jump straight in. Hello, everyone. Nice to hear you wherever you are in the world on YouTube listening. I'm Andrew Mitchell. I spent 40 years at the conservation front line, by the way, starting out as a zoologist, swinging around in trees and hugging orangutans and trees. But now I hug bankers and asset managers because it's all about the money. And we can't save nature unless we redirect the money supply around the world. And if we don't, we'll simply finance ourselves into extinction. So to help us on that route, I and the UNDP, Global Canopy, the World Wildlife Fund, and UNEP-FI in Geneva came together in 2019 to set up a cousin to the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosure that many companies and financial institutions know well. But we need a cousin which is using the same kind of framework, but is focused on everything beyond carbon. And that is what the Task Force on Nature-Related Financial Disclosure is. And it was launched in June this year. We have a lot of financial institutions as members. Same sort of thing. We have about 30, 35 members coming on stream. David Craig from Refinitiv, who's CEO of Refinitiv up until the end of the year, is one of the champions leading it, one of the co-chairs, and Elizabeth Mrema, who heads up the UN Convention on Biodiversity, is the other. And we have a whole secretariat. So we're going to be, over the next couple of years, coming up with a reporting and disclosure framework for the financial sector on nature. And it'll be out in mid-2023.
Thank you so much. So next I'll go to you, Celine. Celine Soubranne from AXA, the Chief Corporate Responsibility Officer. And I wanted you to also introduce yourself, please, and then address what are the key nature-related challenges for financial institutions. We see, again, suddenly investors, insurers are thinking about nature in a big way. I would love to hear from you, especially as you are a member of the TNFD task force, how you're thinking about it in your role.
Yeah, we at AXA, we started to have a commitment around biodiversity very early because in 2013 we made our first biodiversity-related exclusion. It was about palm oil. It was the starting point because there was a lot of controversy around the palm oil production, and we made this first investment exclusion. And after that, we developed a very comprehensive climate strategy. And yes, for us, and it was touched by Andrew, for us, very soon, we realized that we can tackle climate change without tackle biodiversity. Because in one hand, you put a lot of effort to try to reduce CO2 emission, to tackle climate change, and in the other hand, you continue to invest and to provide insurance coverage on activity who put a pressure on some carbon sinks such as ocean or forests. It's not consistent. So that's why we were convinced very, very soon that we have to interconnect the two battles. And that's why in 2019, we published a report in partnership with WWF to explain the materiality of the biodiversity challenge for the financial sector. We gathered all the existing best practice and we called for the creation of the TNFD.
We need to link nature-related topics to financial decisions. And also, if you could introduce yourself, please, that would be great.
Sure, thanks, Divya. So my name is James Scriven. I'm the head of IDB Invest. And probably try to use the language that we've been using to say why a development bank has a way or role over here. One, I'm the CEO of the private sector arm of IDB. So as Andrew and others and Celine have said, development institutions and financial development institutions have a big role to play over here because of their value, their missions, but also their capital that they come to play over here. Second, why Latin America is important. Latin America is a big part of the solution of the issues around climate. It has 30% of the fresh water in the world. It has 40% of the world's biodiversity, and it holds 50% of tropical forests in the world. And when we morph the conversation into nature-based solutions, Latin America is going to be a big part of that solution. I run the private sector arm. And why is that important is that I think we could have thought that the important role of the world are governments, but the real solutions are going to come to the private sector. So that the combination of a development institution with Latin America and the private sector, we do feel that we've got a big role and a big voice to play. Historically, development banks were all about building road, ports, and with no understanding of the impact that nature has over those physical infrastructures. And when you're building a 10-year or 15-year repayment of a port, for example, of a road, analyzing that in isolation of the nature impact that this has, it's undermining the entire risk of an investment. No? So I think historically it was, how do we isolate ourselves from the act of nature that will impact this? That is ancient history, thank God. We're moving into a role where we're looking for companies that are primarily looking to address issues of climate. So technology-wise or infrastructure-wise, how can we create asset classes or investments that are doing positive impact, moving away from the do no harm into the do good space?
Yeah. I think that's a perfect segue actually to what I was going to come to you to discuss, Andrew. So nature-related data, we might all have very different ideas of what that includes. It could be trees or biodiversity, but how do you think about nature-related data as being different from climate potentially?
Well, there are a number of aspects of that. Let's first of all talk about materiality. That's something that we hear quite a lot said in financial institutions. Oh, this nature stuff is what they call non-material. That's like that palm oil example I was giving you. The burning down in the rainforest is non-material to the share price of the palm oil company, except maybe reputational risk and some country risk, right? So it's kind of non-material. So when you're looking at a portfolio, you have to look at its dependency on nature and also its impact on nature. Often impact is a word that financial institutions use to mean, oh, what's the impact on my portfolio? In the NGO world, we talk about impact on nature. So we have to get the language right. So these two things are very important to understand. So the next thing is, so in other words, you need an inside out and an outside in kind of approach to solving this problem. The next thing is, what about the data? What kind of data can we use on nature? Now, with climate, we have a target, 1.5 degrees, ideally. 2 degrees if you're not going to quite get there. We have a currency, a ton of carbon, or ton of CO2 to measure progress. We have none of these things for nature. We don't have numbers for nature. We don't have a target other than maybe we should do no harm by 2030, and 30% of the Earth's surface should be protected by 2030 and half by 2050. So there's a half-Earth concept is the infrastructure we need. Now these targets are set by the equivalent of this meeting, which is the COP that just happened in China. This is the poor cousin that people don't talk about so much, which is the CBD, the Convention on Biological Diversity. It held its first half meeting just a few weeks ago. The second half will be April next year. They're going to come up with a global biodiversity framework, which 200 countries are going to sign up, almost as big as the deforestation pledge that happened yesterday, in fact, bigger. In there should be the financial sector. So there are going to be frameworks coming out with targets through the UN process, which will help companies and the finance sector give them a target to go to. But how do we measure progress? How do we know whether we're winning or losing? Now that gets quite difficult. It might be a hectare of something with some biodiversity on it. You know, a desert doesn't have much biodiversity. What's there is very specialized. A rainforest in a hectare has masses of biodiversity. How do you measure it? Well, it's going to be a combination of top-down and bottom-up. There are new technologies like eDNA, which are coming out with measures in lakes where you can take some water and it will tell you every species that's in the lake, just like that, put it in a machine. Incredible. Satellites are also able to measure how we're doing from space. So a combination of these two things is one of what the TNFD is doing in its knowledge hub and in its technical work. We'll be coming up with measures that will help us to know whether we're winning or losing. And we're going to come out with that by the middle of 2023. So there are new tools coming on all the time. CDC Biodiversity, you might mention something to do with that in Paris, coming up with these measurements. So we're going to get there. It's going to take a few years. Climate's ahead of us, but nature's going to catch up.
So thank you. Coming to you, Celine, on following up on that discussion of the TNFD, why is AXA supportive of the TNFD, and how are you hoping the TNFD will help you integrate nature into investment or insurance decisions?
For us, the TNFD and the question of the metrics and the methodology are really key, because if you want to develop a strategy based on nature solution and to orient the financial flow, you need a measurement because in the finance sector, if you don't measure, you don't pilot. So that's why we have started on our side. So that's why we have called for the creation of the TNFD, and we have internally at AXA started to work on some new metrics. And we use the experience we acquired on climate change, because on climate change, as explained, so we have a trajectory, we have a currency, the CO2, the tons, but we, for example, at AXA, very soon, we invest in the warming potential. The warming potential is a data which allow us which help us to orient the financial flow to be in capacity to align our investment portfolio with the 1.5 trajectory. So, so that's why for biodiversity, we have created a group of French player, with BNP Paribas and with Mirova and Sycomore, and we made a request for proposal to find a provider which will develop useful metrics for our asset management activity and also to take commitment on our asset owner portfolio. So we choose Iceberg Data Lab, which is a very innovative provider, and we will have impact measurements before the end of the year, and this measurement will help us to take new commitments. And in between, we continue. We have recently announced a new policy for our investment and our insurance activities, and we will exclude now all the activity related to deforestation controversy. And in between, we use notably some data from extra-financial agency. So I don't make it advertising. So notably on MSCI data. So in between, we use this kind of data to exclude, because for us it was urgent to have a first commitment, and in parallel we continue to work on a global framework, on a common framework around TNFD, and we hope to put what the experience we have acquired with Iceberg Data Lab on the new impact measurement we will use next year, and to put that in the collective approach.
I worked for an asset owner before coming to S&P, and it was CalPERS, and we were involved in the UNPRI's deforestation engagements. And one of the things that I've noted in now being part of this TNFD standing up process, so I should note that S&P Global is represented both on the task force and within the forum for the TNFD, is that there are so many questions that asset owners have that they're struggling to answer related to nature-related risks. So asset owners have long-dated investment horizons. They're exposed to risk globally, usually because they have these diversified portfolios. But often, when it comes to nature, there are very few kind of, until the launch of the TNFD, coalitions that were kind of serving the needs, I think, of asset owners to think about nature in their portfolio. So from the other side of the coin now, I see as this launches, I'm optimistic that this will help, the sort of top of the investment value chain, if we think of asset owners as serving in that purpose, to really drive more portfolio decisions to consider nature through then the rest of the investment value chain. I think you're expressing something similar, maybe.
Yeah, at the end we will need a convergence, because I think we are all developing practices, but at the end we will need convergence. Again, AXA was a founding member of the TCFD. Today, TCFD is really the global reference, and it's also integrated in all the extra-financial agency approach, and also in the future regulation, notably at European level. We have a regulation which is very, the European Union is very active on the climate-related disclosure. And yes, the TCFD has been adopted by the European Union as a reference. So we hope that the TNFD will have a similar destiny.
Yes. So I think we've talked a bit about risks, but of course there's an opportunity side to this discussion too. And so I was very happy when James was able to join this panel, because I've seen over the last couple of years a lot of activity from IDB Invest related to blue or water-related bonds, and something that was new to me, which is natural asset companies. Can you help us understand how you are finding opportunities already in this, just kind of emerging space?
Sure. Last year, towards the end of last year, we created a sustainable debt issuance program, and under that, we've been able to issue a number of UN Sustainable Development Goals thematic bonds. We've issued gender bonds, we've issued social bonds, we've issued green bonds, and today, actually, we're issuing our first blue bond. This is the first place. This is among us that we're saying it, but we're issuing our first blue bond. We issued it in Australia with Japanese investors, and we've been able to, and this is the beauty of it. Historically, development institutions are only focusing on investing their own capital. The world is moving into development institutions helping connect development assets to impact or development investors. And those are not only development institutions, those are primarily the access of the world. They're looking for these long-term sustainable investments. So our role has shifted. Our role has been more of de-risking projects for others investors to be able to come in, and connecting the wealth that you have of investments in Asia to development assets in Latin America is a big part of our solution. Blue bonds is a nascent industry, I would say. It shouldn't be, but it is. Ours is the first one issued in Latin America, and I think the 7th or 8th in the world. And what we do with those proceeds is lend them to projects that work around protecting oceans, working around coastal areas and everything that relates to water. So that is a big component of the work that we've been doing.
That's amazing, and congratulations. It's such a fast-moving, evolving space of sustainability-linked bonds, and I see that you're creating new asset classes. That's really exciting. It's also something we were speaking about actually at a dinner last night, that a lot of sustainable let's say, sustainable institutional investors are having trouble deploying capital at the scale that it's needed, where there's a big mismatch either in the risk perception of a project or the amount of scale they want to deploy versus what a project needs. So it's exciting to see development banks, evolving to fill that space and really providing not exactly the bridge financing, but serving as a bridge to get a lot of these projects off of the ground. Are you seeing more interest from institutional investors in this?
Very much. I mean, the growth that there is in assets under management in the impact investor space is growing exponentially, but there is still a gap between the perception of risk and the reality of risk. And I'm saying this because most of the development challenges in the climate space are in emerging markets. And many of these international investors have a threshold of investment grade below which they do not or cannot invest. And creating investment grade assets in emerging markets is a big role that us as development institutions have to play by de-risking assets for long-term investors to be able to come in. So the reason why we work, especially in Latin America, is grabbing those assets that are sub-investment grade, playing an active role in the construction of a project or de-risking a project. So when that is already up and running and the risk is no longer there, we're able to crowd in international investors that are looking for that ESG investment.
Yeah, super exciting. And so, so we've gone deep into, finance land. Pulling back out to remembering where we are here at COP, I wanted to pivot a bit to a policy discussion. So maybe if I could start with you, Celine, and then come to you, Andrew. What is the most urgent policy change that you think financial institutions should be making to begin considering natural capital and nature-related information in their decisions?
We need a strong COP 15 because what the Paris Agreement made for the climate, we need it for the biodiversity challenge. So it's very simple, but it's not to say, but it's not an easy task. So I think that's the first thing we need. My other thought on that is that we have no regulation coming from the European Union. AXA is a French and European-based group, so we are very sensitive, of course, of our regulation. And the European taxonomy has classified all the industrial activities regarding the impact on climate change. And now the European Union starts the same work for nature and biodiversity, and we will have very soon a regulation on that, a taxonomy for regarding the impact on biodiversity. And specifically in France, we have already a new regulation to disclose our biodiversity impact in the annual report, so that will make more data available to start to orient the activities, the commitment, the engagement. So that's where we are in Europe and France. But again, the convergence, notably through the TNFD, will be more impactful because it will be a global framework on a voluntary approach. But I think we can really make an influence and a difference through this common framework.
And is there a role for financial institutions to be linking, just as, you know, there are many here saying climate change matters to us and we want to see, you know, a strong deal from COP26. The same, I think this trend sort of really took off at COP21 in Paris. Is there a role for financial institutions to be engaging policymakers on biodiversity in that way?
Yeah, I think that the awareness in the finance sector is high now, and we need the tool and again the metrics and the methodology. And yes, we engage a lot with our regulators, with the public authorities, because again, if we don't have the trajectory, and the trajectory has to be put by the public authority, it will make our commitment more complex and our own policy more difficult to put in place.
Okay. And as promised, I'll come to you, Andrew, next, and then James, it looks like you have something to add as well.
Well, I think I would say on policy, you only have to look at what's going on in Paris to see the kind of pathway that we should be on. Article 29, which comes into force next year, requires not only reporting on climate, but also biodiversity. They bolted biodiversity on, even though the methodologies to do that are just emerging. And I was discussing it with him. I said, wow, that's quite innovative, really, because a lot of other regulators wait until the methodologies are there, and only then do they produce the regulation. In France, it's the other way around. And they say, well, it'll stimulate the innovation. And they're right. We're seeing the taxonomy coming out in Europe, but also anti-money laundering, too. The new directives on that are including illegal deforestation and illegal fishing, the SFDR regulations that came in earlier this year. You know, anyone in the finance industry would have to be blind if they didn't think that this landscape is changing very fast. Now, a very significant thing happened yesterday, too. 100 governments saying we're pledging to end deforestation by 2030. Whether they do or they don't, it actually puts nature-based solutions on an equal footing with renewable energy. So this is starting to really raise the game on the importance of nature-based solutions, and it is pointless to go tearing down this infrastructure. Think of it like infrastructure that keeps the earth safe. We should be restoring it and building it back up. And so this is a very important inflection point, I think, here on that, and it's good that lots of financial institutions have signed up to that. Let's see what they do. It's a little strange that no banks have, because the food industry is mainly a lending business. And the food industry is the largest cause of the destruction of nature on the planet. So we're going to see a big transformation, I think, over the next decade. What I like to call renewable food is going to emerge alongside renewable energy as a great upside opportunity. It'll be things like new kinds of meat without meat. It will be things like vertical farming, producing food in cities without supply chains across the world. It will be things like feeding fish farms with insect protein, biodigesting waste. All of these things are going to be amazing investment opportunities. So whilst today there's a relatively small number of things for this large money to go into, and we do need to de-risk, and that's where development banks can really help. In the future, I think it's a slight reframing of what we mean by a nature-based solution, and that's all going to chase up. And then we need the regulatory squeeze gradually tightening so that the reporting that's required begins to reflect that widening, not just to look at financial capital in your annual report, but also look at human, social, and natural capital. That's a much better readout of the resilience of a company, and that's good news for investors.
Go ahead.
No, I love this statement, Andrew, that nature-based solutions. I've always been told by everybody, including my kids, just leave nature alone and it'll regenerate on its own. Just don't interfere. But I just wanted to say also that as a development institutions, throughout the history, there have been leading roles that development institutions have played. At the beginning was the Equator Principles, then the performance standards, and I wanted to reiterate what happened yesterday as the heads of MDBs, multilateral development banks, launched a joint statement integrating in everything we do people, nature, and planet. That is an innovative way of doing it. And why is this important? Because the development space, the IMF and all the multilaterals are in this phase of helping build back better after the pandemic or during the pandemic. And this building back better means a green, inclusive, sustainable growth and not the type of growth we had in the past. So these big statements, as what the multilateral development banks, I think, go a long way in demonstrating how we're thinking and how the industry should be thinking.
Thank you all. So we have about 10-15 minutes left. I wanted to ask the audience whether you have any questions. If not, we have some canned ones we can turn to. Mike, you always have a question.
Thanks for that
To
prompt,
put my
Divya.
colleague on the spot.
Hi, Mike Wilkins from S&P Global Ratings, Sustainable Finance Team, and Imperial College Centre for Climate Finance and Investment. So my question really is around supply chain monitoring, and to what extent do you think that monitoring supply chains in countries such as Brazil and Indonesia, where deforestation is such a huge issue, can actually have an impact in terms of showing where the damage is being caused and helping to incentivize the reversal by more sustainable supply chain monitoring and management? And a second question, if I may, is in relation to natural capital accounting. How far away do you think we are from the introduction of natural capital accounting in real terms? And if so, if we are to expect it being implemented, what impact do you think it could have?
Example, and then someone else can pick up on the accounting. My think tank in Oxford, Global Canopy, came up with the Stockholm Environment Institute, a way of tracing the movement of soy around the world. Now, this is known to big traders, but it's not public information, so they're not going to tell you. They'll tell their clients. And so the way we did it was buying VAT receipts, effectively, for the whole of Brazil for all soy transactions. You can buy this data. And that gives you a date, a location, and an amount and a value. And so you pinpoint what's going on and where it's going on. You then add to that satellite data on deforestation, human rights data, water data, biodiversity data. And we've created trace.earth, which is a fantastic system. You can click on any province in Brazil and you can see where all that soy is going, who the traders are, and if you go into Trace for finance, you can find out who's financing the whole supply chain. This has blown transparency out of the water. This data was only held by big traders and it wasn't available. So this is very useful for governments and these people who signed up to this declaration yesterday to know where the stuff is being produced, whether it's associated with good, red, amber or green deforestation, high risk, medium, low risk, and where it's all going and the entirety of that supply chain and all the little companies that hide the finance through that chain. You can find that out now. So the question is, okay, so what happens? Now we know, but does it change anything? Well, it does mean that the big buyers, and it could be a company like Mars, for instance, that puts a lot of soy into pet food, or it could be feeding chickens, pigs, and cows in China. The people who are importing those foodstuffs now can know where it's coming from, and it's that they're answerable to their asset owners about what they do about it, and it depends on their policy. And that could be a voluntary thing inside that asset owner. However, the European Union is moving towards, and many of these, 28 of the countries who signed yesterday said, we're going to get deforestation out of our supply chains. We're not going to import it in commodities that we bring into, for example, the European Union. So this kind of trace data is really helpful to allow them to know that, whether they are or they aren't. So I think that kind of data will become more and more useful in squeezing deforestation out of supply chains.
Do either of you want to tackle the natural capital accounting question or supply chain, as you wish?
The one on the natural capital. Could you rephrase your question on natural capital, because I was so.
Yeah, let me rephrase it.
Yeah.
Natural capital accounting and natural capital valuation, as we currently stand, is not really enforced anywhere, as far as I know, as a way of valuing nature. And so corporations are not able to internalize that externality on their balance sheet or their profit and loss or cash flow. And I was just wondering, if we were to get to the stage where natural capital accounting were to be introduced, what impact that could have in terms of sending the incentives to companies who are responsible for deforestation, for example, to actually reduce the impact they're having.
Yes, the question of the natural capital is really at the heart of the report we publish with WWF, which is entitled Into the Wild. And yes, it's really the key question is to how we put a price on nature to integrate into our investment, our insurance decision. It's really at the core of the work we will do inside the TNFD. And perhaps, I don't know if it's a direct answer to your question, but for us, it's raised the question of double materiality, because when you analyze the impact of biodiversity loss on our for the financial sector, there is the question of the double materiality, because we have a double impact at the end, because we have the risk put by the biodiversity loss on our healthy economic activities. On the other side, the economic activity put a pressure on the nature. So that's, I have no absolute answer at this stage, because we are starting our work inside the TNFD, but we will probably have to take into account this double materiality in the way we will price and give a price to the natural capital.
Maybe I can just add a little bit to that. Governments are quite well down the track, some of them, on natural capital accounting for their assets in their own country. The UK, for instance, was the first to produce a set of natural capital accounts and a methodology for doing this. In other words, are your forests going up or down? You know, you can measure that pretty accurately from space, and how much biodiversity is in farmland, are the farmland birds and butterflies, you can measure that stuff quite accurately today. Nobody ever publishes it. So you collect that data and you publish it. That's the first step. Companies, it's much harder. One of the missing things is the location of assets. This is something we need to know, so that companies don't routinely publish where their assets are held. So if someone's lending $1 billion to a global headquarters, and there might be 50 mining sites around the world, you need to know where that loan is being deployed. Is that mining site in a desert or a delta? It has a very different water profile if it does, a very different biodiversity profile if it does. So the lender needs to know where those things are in order to be able to assess biodiversity and produce natural capital accounts. Now, S&P has a lot of location data, but it's behind a paywall. So you've got to go and pay for their wonderful services to be able to find that out. We need some of that stuff to be made more public. Now, in Brazil, for certain kinds of loans, you have to publish where that loan is going to be deployed. And I think that's a very good lesson, and maybe the EU and others could think about how we get that sort of location data much more easily accessible, and that will help us to understand the biodiversity risk associated with it.
It's a perfect segue to mention that S&P, we have physical climate risk data, which is enabled by knowing the physical locations. Over 2 million physical locations of company assets have been mapped, and then we've overlaid climate risks on top of that, so wildfire, drought, extreme heat, etc. And now we're working on extending that model to consider biodiversity risks. So stay tuned on that front. And noted, Andrew. I wanted to come now. We're very lucky to have another Task Force for Nature-Related Financial Disclosure, or TNFD, task force member with us here today, Mikako. So if you have any comments you wanted to make listening to this panel, or questions for the panelists, please feel free to chime in.
Thank you very much for the occasion. So I have, in fact, questions first to AXA. It's about so-called iceberg, investment, because I think it's really important to have that kind of scheme to really measure the impact regarding biodiversity, particularly suitable for investors. But also, I'm a little bit concerned if it's like S&P Global database. If it's really, closed only for those who invest, well, we may, for instance, Japanese invest, if we don't have the access to that kind of the metrics or methodology, it's a little bit a sad thing, and we need to reinvent in a sense as well. So do you have a kind of plan to share the knowledge or methodology, or so that kind of thing is also important. And of course, I admire that French investment community, the French financial sector is really advanced in comparing to Japanese investment community. So I'm really admiring that, but also, well, it's kind of the leader's role to show how they can do that. And I also have another question to Andrew, because you talk about a trace. I really, appreciate that effort, but the trace is only focusing on the soy and palm oil, and there are so many other so-called deforestation-related commodities. And thinking of the necessity of big data, I think it's also a kind of the governmental role, a more public role, which should contribute that kind of the database. So how do you think of it? Because now it's really kind of private effort, and of course it's important to do the kind of thing among private sector, but also I think it's important to engage more public sector to widen the coverage, and also the, I don't think it's important to get the mandatory thing, but to really, do more things about the deforestation related thing. I think it's important to get more funding or involvement from the public sector. So what do you think of it? So there's two questions.
So my response will be very quick. Yes, of course, we will share that. That's why we start this work collectively with other peers from the financial sector. We will be at the end of this important work in December, because Iceberg Data Lab is delivering currently all what we have required, and we will share that inside the TNFD. And publicly, we will probably organize an event with our peers, with BNP Paribas, with Mirova, with Sycomore, yes, to make it public. And it will be also an invitation to commit together for further step around biodiversity and how we can have a role in the financial sector.
Mikako, you're right. There is no one central place you can go to get investment-grade data on nature. Probably the nearest is S&P, but you're going to have to pay a lot for it. I mean, look, it's not only MSCI and the others. There are lots of.
This has turned into a roast.
No. There's MSCI. There's loads of. They're really good. They've got that stuff. So, just last week in France was the launch of the One Planet database. It came out of the Finance for Tomorrow event. Now, that is the beginning of this centralizing of data. Probably the best repository at the moment is the World Conservation Monitoring Center in Cambridge, but is no use for investors. So you have to have a translation process. We used it to create Encore. Some of you may have used or heard of Encore, which is a means of screening your portfolio for nature-related dependency and impact. Actually, you can do both now. And that relies on that sort of data. So what we're going to do with TNFD, with One Planet, with World Conservation Monitoring, we've got to pull all this together and get data from different sources. You need corporate source data, you need government source data, you need UN data and academic data. And somehow we've got to pull all that together and then have a big translation process to turn it into something that gives a number for nature that an asset manager can recognize and put on their spreadsheet. That's no mean task, so it will need money. So I think there could be a good way for investors to get around either the One Planet database, but it needs a sort of global effort, and almost a natural capital commission which can create all this data. But the crucial thing is translating it into something that's useful. There's masses of data out there. It's just that it's not what asset managers and lenders need. So that translation process has to come on, and I think we will see that emerge in the next few years.
I think we're almost out of time, but that's a good closing thought to land on, which is coming back to the convening theme of this panel, which is translating nature-related risk and opportunity into finance, and also connecting that to the climate talks and the climate work that we all need to catalyze. So just wanted to come to each of you for a closing minute or so of remarks of anything we may not have covered that we should have, or what your hope is as you see this work develop over the next couple of years.
I can start. I think we've covered a lot in an hour, so I wouldn't say that we had, but I personally learned a lot about this conversation and really pleased to be over here. This is my first COP. I've heard a lot about it, and from now on I'm going to be very, very related to it, because I do think that it's a game changer and the future of what we're looking for.
On my side, I hope that for the next COP next year, we will be able to present the first achievement from the TNFD with Andrew, of course, with other members. And I hope also that in next April, in the biodiversity COP, we will talk also about climate and TCFD as a reverse point.
I would simply say thank you very much for the opportunity to speak. I would just say simply, after climate, nature is next.
Yes.
So get ready.
Indeed. That's certainly what we're hearing, that biodiversity is the next big mega theme. And arguably in some corners it already is, which I'm happy to see. Thank you all so much. I know the logistics and administrative hurdles to get here to this panel and these seats and join us were considerable given the context that we're operating in, but I really just wanted to thank you for the work you're doing and for joining us to share your insights so we can help others to join this effort. Thank you all so much for attending as well.
Thank you.
Thank you.